Hi, I'm Judy Yates Siker, author of your 2016-2017 Horizons Bible Study. And in this DVD, I'll be offering you introductions to the 9 lessons for your study this year. Each lesson a different lens for answering the question, who is Jesus? In these brief introductions, I'll be offering you some insight into and background information about each of these lessons, and I hope that they will be helpful as you go through your study. We're going to begin today with the Gospels. Our first 4 lessons are the Gospels, and our first lesson is the Gospel of Mark. Why? Why Mark when Matthew comes first in our canonical text? Well, Mark's was the earliest Gospel written, and Matthew and Luke each wrote their Gospels based on Mark. If we look at Mark, we see that it is 16 chapters long, and when we begin to do our studies of Matthew and Luke, though they are longer, they're going to follow the same outline. So they must have had some version of Mark's gospel when they wrote. We're going to look at Mark and see what portrait of Jesus this author paints. My hope is as we go through these first 4 lessons, you'll let each one of the gospels stand alone. Let me offer you a suggestion about how to think about this. Pretend that we are going on a hunt. We're going to an art gallery. And we're going to go in and look through the galleries and see if we can answer the question, what did the Holy Family look like? So we go off to one gallery and we find there the ancient Italian masters. And we look at the paintings by those masters and we see the Holy Family. And we notice the rich, beautiful colors and the deep mahogany in the furniture. Yes, the furniture. And as we study these paintings, we notice that the Holy Family is amazingly Italian. So we go to another gallery, perhaps that of the great Dutch masters. And there we view the paintings of the Holy Family, and we're taken by the colors as only the Dutch masters can present them. Those marvelous cobalt blues, the vermilions. And we notice the fabric, and we notice the furniture, and we notice that the Holy Family is amazingly Dutch. And so we take our group to yet another gallery and another. And with each one, we have a similar experience. So late at night, we go in and take one painting from each gallery and cut it up into tiny little pieces and create for ourselves a canvas on which we put together all of those pieces so that we might truly know what the Holy Family looked like. Now you know, and I know, that that would be a mess. There'd be too many eyes and too many noses, and the colors wouldn't blend. We would be no closer to knowing what the Holy Family looked like. Now, why in the world would I tell you such a silly story? Well, it's my belief that if we take the 4 Gospels and cut them up into little pieces and try to put together one picture to answer the question, who is Jesus? The result would be a mess. So what I'd like to invite you to do in these lessons, these first 4 lessons, is to allow each gospel writer to stand alone. Pretend, if you will, that you're in Mark's gallery and you're looking to see what the portrait is he's painting. And then, next time when we go to Matthew, do the same. Leave Mark's gallery and go into Matthew's. I think you'll find some new information, some new insights as you go. So today we start with Mark. We start with Mark because, as I said, he's the earliest. We think that Mark was written somewhere around 68 to 70 CE. 70 CE should be a date that brings to mind for you the fall of the temple in Jerusalem. We're not sure who the author was. We're not sure who any of these authors were, but we will call him Mark because that's the name that's been attributed to this gospel for many, many years. We believe that Mark was written somewhere outside of Palestine. as with the authorship, we don't know historically exactly where any of these Gospels were written. We do believe that Mark's Gospel was written outside of Palestine, and there are several reasons we say that. If we knew Palestinian geography well, and we read Mark's Gospel, we'd realize whoever put this Gospel together did not know Palestinian geography very well. He may have said, turn left at the general store, when really, if we're on our way to Aunt Susie's, we know that you turn right at the general store. His Palestinian geography is not good, and so we presume that this came from somewhere outside of Palestine. A second reason that we assume that this was written outside of Palestine is because when there are Aramaic phrases, Mark translates them. Now, Aramaic was the language of the day in Palestine, and so if there was a tradition, a story that had been preserved orally, and the Aramaic had stayed in that tradition, if this gospel was written within Palestine, it wouldn't need to be translating the Aramaic. You may not have even noticed this, but you will remember that in several places in this gospel, this is so. For example, when Jesus heals the ruler's daughter and he takes her by the hand, the text in Mark says, "And he said to her, Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, rise up." A little later in Mark's gospel, when he's healing the man who is deaf, he puts his fingers in the man's ears and he says, "Ephphatha," which means, Mark tells us, be opened. And then, of course, there is from the Passion narrative, the cry of Jesus from the cross, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," my God, why have you forsaken me?" All three of these are examples of Aramaic that has been preserved in the tradition, but which Mark felt necessary to translate for his readers or his hearers. This is a good time for me to emphasize that those who first were presented with these gospel stories were probably hearers of the word rather than readers of the word. So you'll hear me use that fairly consistently throughout these lessons. One other thing that we want to know about each of these Gospels is what we in biblical scholarship call the Sitz im Leben, a good German term. What it means is setting in life, or the context, if you will. So what is the setting in life? What is the context of this Gospel? It appears to be written for a group of people who are undergoing persecution. All of these things help us when we read Mark's Gospel and see how Mark answers the question, who is Jesus? So think with me about it for a moment. Mark's Gospel begins, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Short, sweet, to the point. That's the way he starts his Gospel. As you study these Gospels in these first 4 lessons, pay attention to the opening line. And then as you want to go back and remember the emphasis or the lens of each Gospel writer, you'll have a clue from the opening line. Mark begins his Gospel this way, and he begins with Jesus as an adult. Not the birth story of Matthew or Luke, not the beginning of creation, as in John, but Jesus as an adult, coming to John the Baptist for baptism. And he moves through his first 8 chapters rapidly. Sometimes I think when I read the Gospel of Mark, I'm looking at a fast-forward film. As you read the Gospel of Mark this time, pay attention to how often he uses the word immediately. You may not notice it on first read, but if you're looking for it, it pops up everywhere. Jesus and his disciples are on the Sea of Galilee, and they land on the shore, and he feeds people or heals people, and immediately he gets back in the boat and crosses the Sea of Galilee. And immediately he gets out, and he and his disciples travel to another town, and immediately they carry on with their ministry. All of this happens very rapidly in the first 8 chapters of Mark. And then when you get to chapter 8, we're at what I call the hinge of the gospel. For at that chapter, the action slows down, and Mark moves us from chapter 8 to chapter 16, moving toward Jerusalem. In chapters 8 to 16, we find from 11 to 16, fully 1/3 of this gospel is the passion narrative. So we know what is the most important element of this story of the life and ministry of Jesus for this gospel writer. Mark's gospel is also characterized by something we call the messianic secret. You know, those times when Jesus performs a healing and then immediately says, now don't tell anyone. Go and offer your gift at the altar. Go and return to your work. As we look back on this gospel, we see that Mark uses this more than any other of the gospel writers, and we wonder why. Why does Jesus want to keep this a secret? Or perhaps more importantly, why does the author we call Mark want to keep this a secret? I think the answer comes for us in this long passion narrative. The way Mark paints the passion of the Christ is in very dark and somber colors. And we see a Christ who is suffering. We see a Christ who falls onto his knees in the garden and asks that the cup might pass. We see a Christ who asks that his disciples stay awake and pray for him, and yet they all fall asleep. We see a Christ who cries out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But what we also see in Mark's gospel is that once we have seen him in his suffering, we can begin to understand who he is. Mark does this in a really beautiful way. After Jesus dies on the cross, we're told that the curtain of the temple is torn in two from top to bottom. And while our first question may be, why is he telling us about something on the Temple Mount when we're concentrating on the crucifixion, we quickly realize that this is a metaphor, that Mark is telling us that that curtain which divided the outer court from the inner part of the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest could enter and only on High Holy Day. Mark is telling us that the curtain is torn, and thus with the death of Jesus, there is nothing that separates us from the presence of God. And if we miss that clue, he follows it immediately with what I call his exclamation point. For he tells us then, just after this, that a Roman centurion, seeing that Jesus had thus breathed his last, said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." How easy is it to know and see that Jesus is the Christ? First, you must see him in his suffering. And when you do, then even a Roman soldier can see and proclaim. For Mark, the lens that he uses is the lens of the suffering of his community. And the aspect of Jesus that he wants to portray and does portray in his gospel is Jesus as the suffering Son of God. What a powerful message to a community that is suffering. What a powerful message to any of us in times of suffering. What a powerful lens for addressing this question. Now, is this the only lens to use? No, it is not. And our next 8 lessons will demonstrate to us other lenses. Is this the only portrait of Jesus in our New Testament? No, it is not. How fortunate are we that we have so many galleries, so many lenses through which to address this question. I hope you enjoy your study of the Gospel of Mark. Read it as if for the first time, and see what you can see about how to answer this question. And next time, we'll turn to the lens that we call the Gospel of Matthew.